of pounds a year per patient.
Absolutely. There are significant hurdles, one of which, as you rightly point out, is access to medical care. Two is these are powerful immunosuppressive drugs. If they are going to be used in context where there's a lot of background infections, such as tuberculosis, greater caution needs to be taken in using these medications.
Looking back through your career as a rheumatologist, how does this fit in terms of major steps forward?
In my career, it's probably the biggest step. From now, it's all free fall, I think. I don't think I'm going to have such a spectacular success again. It doesn't happen often in one's lifetime. 20 years ago, being diagnosed with arthritis would mean you were more likely to be wheelchair-bound. Today, we have children and young adults who are climbing mountains, playing rugby, playing football. So the outcome has been dramatically changed by the advances we've made in treatments.
This is your left eye area that we're most interested in. It's been concentrating on because it's inflamed before. And the cross-section here at the back of your eye, which we call the retina, looks absolutely normal. So we're done.
There were no cells at all then?
No cells.
Wow,
yeah,
brilliant.
really good, which is great.
Well, that's good to hear.
Okay, great. Thank you.
What do you think about the scans?
Good.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, it's really?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions?
No, I haven't got any questions.
Back to school, I'm afraid, then.
Kira and Tracy. Now, Graham, before we go, there's new research this week on psilocybin, which is the ingredient you find in magic mushrooms. And there's been a new study looking at what happens in the brain if it's given to people with depression that's been impossible to treat until then. And there has been interest in this substance for some time, hasn't there?
There have been several smallish studies which suggest that it may be involved in depression somehow, but it's not clear how, and we need more research. And this study was fascinating, small, only about 19 patients in the UK, but it does suggest that this chemical may somehow sort of reboot the brain to treat some of these patients with depression that doesn't respond to treatment. What the researchers did was they took questionnaire studies of how they were in terms of their depression, but also then scanned their brains using functional MRI scanning to check the activity of the brain, looking at blood flow and so on, to see what effect the psilocybin had on both how they felt depression-wise and also what was going on in their brain. And it was fascinating, really. All 19 patients said their depression had improved immediately after taking the chemical, and almost half still felt benefits 5 weeks later. And what was going on in the brain from the scans seemed to be effectively a kind of a powering down of some parts of the brain that we know are involved in depression, and then a sort of back to normal slope upwards. It's a bit like turning your computer on and off, as if it resets the brain. Now, there were weaknesses with the study. There was no comparison group, so it's difficult to draw many conclusions of whether it's actually the chemical doing this. And they also had other types of psychological care. So we do need bigger trials, randomized controlled trials to see whether it actually is like the computer turning off and on. But it's interesting.
And it's interesting to see it seems to reduce activity in the default mode network, which is this area which seems very active when we're mind wandering. So it's almost as if it's stilling the mind and stopping people perhaps ruminating about some of the negative things and starting over again.
That's right. And also another one of the parts of the brain is the amygdala, which is heavily involved in emotions like fear and anxiety. So it maps very neatly onto the areas of brain that we know are involved in depression. And it could be that this could open up some interesting areas in future research, looking at whether this could be used in depression. A big caveat, the authors warn people with depression not to try this chemical or the mushrooms or other psychedelic drugs to treat themselves, because of course it can be dangerous, and in many countries it's illegal.
And of course they did this in very controlled circumstances where they were looking after people
exactly,
really well.
In clinical trials with medical supervision.
Thanks very much for joining us today, Graham Easton. Always good to have you here. Now remember, if you want to make sure you hear every episode of Health Check, do subscribe for free to the BBC's podcast. Next week, what a study of gut microbes of more than 200 Chinese people over the age of 95 can tell us about a healthy old age. I'm Claudia Hammond. Do join me next week if you can.
This is the BBC World Service, where we're looking for solutions to the problem of domestic violence.
100 women on the BBC World Service.
The domestic violence will always happen if the men keep thinking that they have the right to hit the woman, and if the wife keep thinking that they deserve to hit by the man.
Behind closed doors. Listen to the whole series at bbcworldservice.com/100women. You're listening to the BBC World Service.
Our diplomatic correspondent James Landell was at the court to hear.
As our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale reports from Mosul.
Our Africa editor Mary Harper reports.
Let's go to Hong Kong now. Time for business news. On our business desk is Andrew Wood.
Available on the BBC iPlayer radio app. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello and welcome to Newsday from the BBC World Service with Shaima Khalil and Lawrence Pollard.
Our top story this morning, separatists in the Spanish region of Catalonia are threatening to declare independence if the government starts to impose direct rule. There's a deadline. In a few hours' time, we get advice from a constitutional lawyer.
We'll also take you to what could become the world's largest refugee camp, a special report on the front lines of the Rohingya crisis.
Also, German researchers have identified an alarming decline in the population of flying insects. Also on the way, Vivian Nunes with the business.
Several British banks are likely to be investigated over allegations they may have been used to launder money stolen from the South African state.
And Matthew Kenyon with his sports news. A remarkable comeback by Roma leaves Chelsea boss Conte unhappy about lots of things, actually.
And finally, why the Canadian Prime Minister is weeping openly at a press conference. All of that coming up after the latest world news.
I'm Stuart McIntosh with the BBC News. Hello. The head of Catalonia's regional government has said he'll activate an independence declaration if Spain takes steps to impose direct rule. Spain's central government has been pressing Carles Puigdemont to confirm whether Catalonia intends to secede after a disputed referendum earlier this month. A deadline set by Madrid for his response is due to run out in a few hours. Tom Burridge reports.
If Catalonia's devolved government does not clearly state that it has not declared independence from Spain, then the Spanish government will make an unprecedented move. It will, for the first time ever, invoke broad constitutional powers. In reality, it will be a list of measures designed to exert direct control over the Catalan authorities. For Madrid, this is about protecting the Spanish constitution and disciplining an unruly, disobedient devolved government, which held an illegal referendum earlier this month.
The British banking groups HSBC and Standard Chartered are likely to be investigated over new claims that they may have been used to launder money stolen from the South African state. The British Finance Ministry has referred allegations raised by the former Cabinet Minister Lord Hayne to the Serious Fraud Office. Andrew Harding reports.
This is a new twist in a giant corruption scandal that's shaking the South African state and damaging the reputations of a number of global companies. Lord Hayne says whistleblowers have told him that hundreds of millions of pounds have been taken out of South Africa illegally via Hong Kong and Dubai. The Treasury has now asked the Serious Fraud Office and other agencies to investigate whether HSBC and Standard Chartered may, unwittingly, have been used to transfer stolen funds. At the centre of the allegations are South Africa's President Jacob Zuma and a wealthy business family, the Guptas. Both deny any wrongdoing.
New figures show that China's economy grew 6.8% in the third quarter. Robin Brandt in Beijing has the details.
As is so often the case, the official figures are in line with those forecast by China's government. That is especially helpful at the moment because China's ruling Communist Party is currently meeting here in its 5-yearly gathering to anoint President Xi Jinping for another term. At 6.8% growth, the economy is expanding slightly slower than at the start of the year, but it's above the goal for all of 2017. But China is experiencing a slowdown. It's gradual, but the economy here is expanding at its smallest rate for a generation.
Scientists in Germany have documented a steep decline in the population of flying insects in less than 30 years. The study, carried out in 63 German nature reserves, showed a loss of more than 3/4 of the total biomass of flying insects, including butterflies, bees and moths. World News from the BBC. President Donald Trump is at the centre of a deepening controversy over his treatment of the families of fallen servicemen. The White House has been forced to defend the president against accusations that he told the widow of a US soldier killed in Niger that her husband had known what he'd signed up for. The Washington Post newspaper, meanwhile, reported that $25,000 promised in June to the father of an army sergeant killed in Afghanistan had failed to materialise. An independent expert appointed by the United Nations says the policies promoted by the International Monetary Fund undermine the UN's human rights and development goals. Presenting his report on the promotion of international democracy and equality, Alfred de Zayas said that the IMF tended to prioritise economic growth over human rights and the environment. Leaders from 12 African nations are due to meet in the Congolese capital Brazzaville for a two-day summit that will address some of the continent's most intractable problems. The International Conference on the Great Lakes region will discuss a range of violent conflicts, including those in the Central African Republic, Burundi, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Sudan. An appeal court in Tunisia has upheld the public indecency conviction of a couple arrested in September for kissing in a car. Nassim Ouadi, who is French, was also accused of refusing to obey police after they apprehended him. Kat Wiener reports.
It's a case which has triggered indignation around the world, nowhere more so than in Tunisia itself, where lawyers and civil rights groups say it raises important questions about morality campaigns and police behaviour. Nassim Ouadi says the couple were hugging, not kissing, when they were ordered out of the car, and that hostile police exaggerated the charges because he challenged them. The prosecution insists that the couple were naked and engaged in a sexual act when stopped. Mr. Ouadi was sentenced to 4 months and the woman to 2 months in prison.
BBC News.
Many thanks indeed for the latest. Hello, welcome to Newsday with Shaima and Lawrence, and we do have a lot of constitutional advice for you this morning. In half an hour or so, the chances of the Kenyan election rerun taking place in a few days' time, and in a moment, advice on the Spanish rules, Article 155, direct rule for Catalonia, all that sort of stuff.
And why the windscreen test is right. There are fewer bugs splatting, and it really does matter. Also, the Canadian Prime Minister is in tears, and a nation is mourning a rock singer, but as you'll hear, not just any rock singer.
Let's start with the arguments in Catalonia and the deadline after the deadline before. The burning question, has Catalonia or has it not declared independence from Spain? To remind you of the background of this, the regional leader, Carles Puigdemont, called a referendum on independence from Spain. He said he won, but then said he wasn't technically declaring independence until he'd had more negotiations with the government in Madrid.
Madrid instead set him a deadline to say if he had or hadn't declared independence, which passed, and then set another deadline, which is about to expire. If he doesn't make his position clear in 3 hours' time, they will assume he has declared independence and will impose direct rule.
Now, Mr. Puigdemont is reported as saying that if that happens, he will declare independence. Is all this legal? Is it constitutional? We need a constitutional lawyer. So we're going to talk to Professor Carlos Flores, professor in that area at the University of Valencia. Thank you very much indeed. First off, can I just check, did we sum it up pretty much accurately? There are many ways that you could sum it up, but we didn't say anything misleading in our introduction, did we?
Not at all. You did it beautifully. I mean, you showed it as complex and as paradoxical and as controversial and as contradictory as it really is. Yes,
well,
you did
thank
a great
you
job.
very much. I'd like to tell our listeners I had no idea the professor was going to say that. Now, can I ask, in 3 hours' time, I think it's 3 hours local time.
Yeah, 10 o'clock.
When this deadline expires, what actually happens on a practical level? What is triggered? Can you explain that to us?
Well, to begin with, President Puigdemont was given a deadline which finished last Monday to clarify whether he had declared independence or not, and a second deadline which ends up today, 10 o'clock our time, to revert the measures taken. So far, he took refuge in ambiguity in order to respond to the first question, as you clarified. But now there is no place to ambiguity. I mean, the government is requiring that the laws that the provisional constitution that he passed earlier in September be declared null and void, and that's something that requires clear action on his side, that it's not going to be taken. So after his more than previsible silence, the way to suspend autonomy is wide open for the central government.
Right, and how clear is the process of doing that? Because I understand from reading around this that article in the Constitution, this now famous Article 155, I mean, it's not written with the idea of doing this now. It was written in 1978. It's now being interpreted to mean something. How would that happen?
Well, the problem is that, as it many times happens with constitutional law, you don't address an issue when it is not an issue, when it's not a candid issue, and when it becomes a hot issue, you prefer not to deal with it. So we have the article in the Constitution, but we don't have any law that clarifies the scope of this provision. The provision was taken from the German basic law, where it has never been applied, and it has never been applied before here. So basically, what we know, or what the Constitution tells, is that when the government considers that the self-governing community does not fulfill the obligations imposed upon it by the Constitution or other laws, or acts in a way that is seriously prejudicial to the general interests of Spain, the government may intervene in this community.
But there is no statement of what that intervention means, because it could be anything from just saying something on television in an address to the nation to sending in the troops.
No. In order to send the troops, you need to apply another article, which is 116, which prevents the declaration of the state of emergency, which is a different thing. No, in this case, basically what the government can do is to take measures necessary to compel the community to meet said obligations and even instruct the authorities of this community. So we are not in the domain of a martial rule at all.
Right, that's good to know. Now, the regional leader, Mr. Puigdemont has said that if this step is taken, he will declare independence again or more officially. But there is this idea floating around of another election, the possibility of another election in Catalonia, to a regional election to sort of cut the Gordian knot, to try to start afresh. Who calls that constitutionally?
Well, at this point, the only person who can call a new election is President Puigdemont himself. But if the autonomy was suspended and his functions, his role was taken over by the central government, it could be the central government who called for this election. And believe me, these two possibilities are entirely different scenarios. If the central government called the elections, it may be forced to face the boycott of the local governments, or the Catalan government himself, who would not cooperate, or the Catalan nationalist parties who would not run for this election. But if it was President Puigdemont who called the election, he would basically compromising his own future and the future of his party and the future of his project.
Carlos, thank you very much indeed. It's a good time to be a constitutional lawyer in Spain at the moment. That was Carlos Flores, professor at the University of Valencia, with a 101 on the Spanish Constitution for us. Thanks to him.
Now, let's take you to Bangladesh, where authorities have announced plans to build the biggest refugee camp in the world to accommodate almost 1 million Rohingya Muslims from Myanmar. Half that number have fled Myanmar in just the last 2 months. A senior British government official says claims of ethnic cleansing in Myanmar are increasingly accurate. Now, thousands more refugees are spending a fortnight stranded close to the Bangladesh border, as Clive Myrie reports.
In the distance in Myanmar, where Rohingya villages have burned in recent weeks and the people have been driven out, there's another fire. It's ethnic cleansing, says the UN. And the purged are fleeing for their lives into neighbouring Bangladesh.
In my village, many were killed, but my son had just been born, so we have only now been able to escape.
As we drew closer to the border, nothing had prepared us for the full extent of the day's exodus. Almost as far as the eye could see, left and right, a tide of humanity. Between 10 and 15,000 people had crossed the border in one night. Young and old, hungry, exhausted, traumatized. And for the weak, it's a painful journey into exile.
So many young children we're seeing here today. This has to be one of the biggest single-day influxes of refugees from across the border, just over there, in the whole of this crisis.
This day-old baby has no name. In the French...
Clive Myrie reporting from the Bangladesh border.
Could that refugee camp be even bigger than Dadaab and Bidi Bidi, which at the moment appear to be the largest refugee camps in the world? It's 1:15. This is Newsday, Sport and Business. On the way, and a tearful Prime Minister Trudeau as well. But first we're going to talk insects. Scientists in Germany say that the number of flying insects has decreased sharply. By that, they mean that according to their studies, there are now a quarter of the number of insects that there were 30 years ago. That means butterflies, bees, moths, all those creatures that play a vital role in pollinating plants and also feeding birds. Now, the German scientists didn't give a reason for the drop. They were studying nature reserves surrounded by agricultural land. They suggest pesticides might have something to do with it. Lead researcher is Hans de Kroon.
In the modern agricultural landscape, for insects, it's a hostile environment. It's a desert, if not worse. And the decline there has been well documented. The big surprise is that it is also happening in adjacent nature reserves, for which we thought so far that they were doing quite well. We should be far more cautious with our insects than we have been even in the recent past. What we need to do is to encourage and bring into effect all sorts of measures that we know are profitable for insects.
That's Hans de Kroon. Casper Hallman, who worked with Hans de Kroon on the research, said it confirmed what is known as the windscreen phenomenon.
We've been alarmed by many people claiming to have less insects being squashed on the windscreens in recent years. But then we never had the scientific data at hand to be able to say this is really the case. And this is the first time that we can actually confirm that, well, what you see on your windscreen is actually taking place, and here's the figure of 75% at least.
Lots of consideration about what the implications of that actually are for life on the planet. 17 minutes past the hour, time now for the business. And before that, Matthew Kenyon with the sport.
Hi, Lawrence. It might have been entertaining for the neutral, but if you're Chelsea boss Antonio Conte, you'll be very frustrated this morning because having been 2-0 up against Roma in the European Champions League, they conceded 3 in a row before Eden Hazard rescued a point for them with an equaliser 15 minutes from time. Injuries on Conte's mind at the moment, and a little spat with Jose Mourinho as well, whose Manchester United side are top of their pool with 3 wins out of 3 after a 1-0 victory in Portugal over Benfica. Sometimes I feel being good defensively is a crime, Mourinho said, but that is a way of getting results. The other standout games for you, Barcelona beating Olympiacos 3-1 with Lionel Messi getting his 100th goal, and Atletico Madrid only 2 points from 3 games after a shock 0-0 draw with Karabag in Azerbaijan. And the NFL have finished their meeting between the owners and the players' union. They have not made a ruling about the national anthem. They have declined to say that players should stand for the national anthem. They say they want them to, but they won't force them. President Trump reacted. Too much talk, not enough action. Stand for the national anthem was his comment.
Many thanks, Matthew Kenyon. More in 20 minutes' time. Now, the sport and corruption in South Africa is always a big story for us on this programme, and now a former British cabinet minister, originally from South Africa, has alleged that UK banks have been used to launder money stolen in the country. He's written to the finance minister in Britain to complain about it and raise it as an alarm. Vivian, who's talking? What's he saying?
This is Lord Peter Hain, who's the former cabinet minister. He was a Labour Party politician from 1991 to 2015 here in the UK, and he now describes himself as a campaigner. He says a South African whistleblower has indicated to him that several British banks might have been used as conduits for money raised by corrupt means. He's going to raise that in the House of Lords later today, and the Financial Conduct Authority, the financial watchdog here in Britain, says it's already in contact with those banks thought to be involved. But really this case centres on the alleged ties between South Africa's President Jacob Zuma and a wealthy and powerful family, the Guptas, which we've talked a lot about on Newsday. Right,
OK. And another story here, 30 years on it is since stock markets crashed on what was known as Black Monday. It's always a time for looking back and assessing, I suppose, what are the chances it could happen again?
Well, interestingly enough, we're seeing a bit of a bubble at the moment. So on Wednesday, the Dow Jones Industrial Average closed at a record high. That was at 23,157. The other two major indices in the US for the stock markets, the Nasdaq and the S&P 500, also posted record levels. Does look like a bubble. Is it going to burst is the question. John Lonsky is with Moody's Analytics.
It may not burst anytime soon. An overvalued equity market does not necessarily imply that doom impends. However, once we reach that point where we have a shrinkage of profitability or a very steep climb by interest rates, the equity market is in danger of quickly falling by 20 to 40%.
John Lonsky there from Moody's Analytics.
Viv with the business. Thank you.
You're listening to Newsday on the BBC World Service. Let's take you to Ukraine now, and it could be a world's first. Ukraine is considering setting up a corruption court. Later today, politicians will be discussing plans to lift their own immunity from prosecution to help curb widespread fraud in the country. On Tuesday, thousands rallied outside Parliament in support of the bill. Let's speak to one of the politicians leading the calls for a change, Sergei Lyshenko. Mr. Lyshenko, thank you for your time. How bad is corruption in Ukraine that politicians are talking about giving up immunity?
Yeah, I agree that corruption is a big story, not only for South Africa, but for Ukraine as well. And we need a corruption court to have a resolution of anti-corruption investigation conducted by newly established anti-corruption bureau. And there are a big agenda of anti-corruption changes in Ukraine.
Why are the normal courts not working, though?
Say again?
Why not normal courts?
Because the system is corrupt, and to start cleaning the house, we need to establish an anti-corruption court, which is going to be the beginning of a big anti-corruption fight in Ukraine.
That's quite a damning stance. What you're saying implicitly there is that Ukrainian politicians are corrupt, the judicial system is corrupt, so you need something completely independent from both of them.
Yeah, I agree. And what we have in reality, we have that corruption is a problem for Ukraine during decades, but only now, since the revolution of dignity happened 3 years ago, the start of anti-corruption fight happened, and now to complete this establishment of anti-corruption institutions, we need an anti-corruption court. This is the reason why thousands of Ukrainians came out in the beginning of this week on the streets to protest.
Why would the thousands of Ukrainians that rallied outside the parliament believe you or any other politician when they say that, you know, they're giving up immunity, we're open for corruption courts? And how do you guarantee the independence and the credibility of that court?
We have experience when we established the Corruption Bureau and law enforcement agency. Idea is to make nomination process open for public, totally transparent, and to involve different stakeholders to make this nomination process clean without any external influence of political clans. So the idea is to have completely different system which we have now in our regular judicial system.
Someone listening might say there's no chance that, you know, MPs, members of parliament, politicians will give up their own immunity, to be open to anti-corruption courts. That sounds implausible.
I not agree, because in Ukraine, what we have now, comparing to previous experience, we have very strong demand of society to have zero tolerance on corruption among politicians. And that is why people are ready to protest in front of parliament to achieve this positive agenda. This is not a protest against somebody, this is a protest to support ideas which makes politics cleaner. This is anti-corruption court, this is immunity to cancel this institution of immunity and to new legislation on election.
You're clearly behind this move, but many other politicians may not be. What kind of opposition have you been getting? What kind of discussions have you been having with other politicians?
Discussion is that it's very difficult in this transition period to create this majority for such changes, but if people stand in front of parliament, it's much more possible to have successful resolution, because people in Ukraine are very vocal, society is very vocal, and it's less and less arguments for politicians, for corrupt politicians, to say they not agree with this big anti-corruption reform in Ukraine.
Sergei Lyshenko, one of the politicians leading the calls for a corruption court. We'll follow up on that, of course. We'll see if it happens, and if it does, who keeps it accountable. Many thanks.
24 minutes past the hour. Now, US-backed alliance of Syrian fighters says it now has full control of the city of Raqqa, the headquarters, of course, of the so-called Islamic State. Operations are still underway to uncover cells to remove remaining landmines in the area, and humanitarian agencies say that the 4-month assault has pretty much destroyed Raqqa's civilian infrastructure and homes, leading to 300,000 people fleeing to nearby camps. With IS losing their so-called capital, what is next for the group? Charlie Winter is from the International Centre for Counterterrorism.
I think we need to recognise that success for the Islamic State looks very different to what we would imagine is success. Material defeat for it in Raqqa, in Mayadin, in Mosul, in Tal Afar, across Libya, and most of the territory that it was holding in Sinai as well. I mean, the group is certainly, materially speaking, a shadow of its former self, but we have to recognize that mere survival is success for the group. And in ideological terms, I think there's a very good case to be made to say that it's actually stronger than it's ever been. I think that what we could well see happening in the next few months, next few years, is a continuation of the Islamic State, but one that looks very different to that which we've observed over the last few years. One which is more of a covert insurgency than something which is overtly trying to govern a contiguous piece of land. I think that terrorism, violence generally, has become more important as a commodity to keep the Islamic State alive, to keep the idea and to keep the sense that there is a momentum behind that idea, to keep it all afloat. And you can see that over the last few months, how it's communicated about acts of terrorism around the world to its own supporters. The Islamic State talks about terrorism a lot more in its propaganda that's geared towards communicating with supporters than it does anywhere else. Whether it's in its newspapers, its radio bulletins, its domestic videos, all of this stuff, it all gets spoken about a huge amount in the actual caliphate itself.
That was analysis from Charlie Winter.
Now to one of our most watched stories online, and it's not every day you see a world leader openly weep during a press conference, but that's what happened in Canada. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been paying tribute to Gord Downie, the lead singer of the Tragically Hip, one of the country's most loved bands.
We lost one of the very best of us this morning. Gord was my friend, but Gord was everyone's friend. It's who we were. Our buddy Gord, who loved this country with everything he had, and not just loved it in a nebulous, oh, I love Canada way. He loved every hidden corner, every story, every aspect of this country that he celebrated his whole life. And we are less as a country without Gord Downie in it. And we all knew it was coming, but we hoped it wasn't. And I thought I was going to make it through this, but I'm not. It hurts.
Well, that's the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. So who was this extraordinary man, Gord Downie? Well, Canadians won't need to be told this, but the rest of us, I suppose in a sense, he's seen rather as Canada's national poet. He was a very gifted lyricist. They're a rocky band. They sound, as you'll hear, a little bit like R.E.M., if that helps you make sense of them and so on. But they were unique to Canada. Also, they weren't very successful outside Canada, which is interesting. Mr. Downie knew that he had been gravely ill. Their farewell concert was several months ago. He finally died on Tuesday of brain cancer at the age of 53.
Now, one comment on social media by JB put the band in context. Gord Downie and the Tragically Hip represent the sliver of genuine Canadian culture that still exists in a country dominated by a massive cultural juggernaut to the south. They write songs about Canada and our shared experience, and they rarely pander to the American audience, and this is why they were called Canada's local band.
You're with the BBC World Service, where we're exploring the lives, opportunities, and daily challenges of women around the globe.
100 Women on the BBC World Service.
This place offers a chance to build a different kind of society from the ground up.
Hopefully one day they will accept the idea that a woman can do something. A woman can be whatever she wants.
The thing is, you can't expect results immediately. You have to take everything one step at a time.
Join us for a season of stories and solutions from 100 of the world's most inspiring women.
One of the most important messages that I can give is to try and strive to be more than you think you can. Because for me, I got to live my dream.
The BBC's 100 Women.
They need to know that these girls are their sisters and these girls need to be respected.
On radio, TV, and at bbcworldservice.com/100women.
Hello and welcome. This is Newsday from the BBC World Service with Lawrence Pollard and Shaima Khalil.
A week to go until the scheduled rerun of the Kenyan elections, but can it go ahead if even the head of the Electoral Commission says the vote isn't really credible? We'll be live in Nairobi.
And it's nearly a week since the massive bomb blast in Mogadishu, and the mourning for loved ones goes far beyond Somalia, as we'll hear from someone here in the UK.
First to Spain in our roundup of the latest world news.
BBC News with Stuart McIntosh. The head of Catalonia's regional government has said he'll activate an independence declaration if Spain takes steps to impose direct rule. Spain's central government has been pressing Carles Puigdemont to confirm whether Catalonia intends to secede after a disputed referendum earlier this month. A deadline set by Madrid for his response is due to run out in a few hours. New figures show that China's economy grew 6.8% in the third quarter. Observers say the figures were in line with expectations, and the data will help support the Chinese government's assertions of economic prowess. The British banking groups HSBC and Standard Chartered are likely to be investigated over new claims that they may have unwittingly been used to launder money stolen from the South African state. The British Finance Ministry has referred allegations raised by the former Cabinet Minister and anti-apartheid activist Lord Hayne to the Serious Fraud Office. President Donald Trump is at the centre of a deepening controversy over his treatment of the families of fallen servicemen. The White House has been forced to defend the president against accusations that he told the widow of a US soldier killed in Niger that her husband had known what he'd signed up for. Leaders from 12 African nations are due to meet in the Republic of Congo for a summit that will address some of the continent's most intractable problems. The International Conference on the Great Lakes region will discuss a number of conflicts, including those in the Central African Republic, Burundi, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Sudan. Scientists in Germany have documented a steep decline in the population of flying insects in less than 30 years. The study, carried out in 63 German nature reserves, shows a loss of more than 3/4 of the total biomass of flying insects, butterflies, bees and moths. BBC News.
Many thanks to Stuart for the latest loan. Welcome to Newsday. Shaima Khalil and Lawrence Pollard with you for a half hour that will take us to Kenya, the United States and the DRC.
Yeah, good news for lovers of the Diffa pepper. We visit one of the most spectacular national parks of the DRC. It's gone, it hopes, from no-go area to tourist attraction. We join the tourists as they climb up a volcano.
Let's start with Kenya. And if things go according to plan, Kenya will hold a rerun of its cancelled presidential election next week. But at this stage, that's a very big if. And the reason for that is that the main opposition leader, Raila Odinga, has said he won't take part. This week as well, a senior member of the Electoral Commission resigned. That's Rosalind Akombi, who told this program that the electoral body was under political siege and unable to reach consensus or take any decisions.
Well, a few hours after that, the man who chairs the commission, Wafula Chebukati, conceded that he couldn't guarantee the poll would be credible.
It's already painful for me to be on record as the chairman of the IBC that presided over a presidential election that was nullified by the Supreme Court. I've made this point on numerous occasions to my colleagues at the Commission. I've made several attempts to make critical changes, but all my motions...
He feels that there is still a chance to make things right. He has called for a meeting with the presidential candidates later today, but I have seen a message from one of the presidents, the director of digital at the presidency, saying that the president isn't going to attend that meeting. And so if it doesn't happen, if not all the candidates attend that meeting, then it could mean that the stalemate continues and put more and just leave everybody in limbo. Is this election actually going to take off?
And I mean, it just seems to be falling apart day after day, this domino effect of the direction that this is going. What do you think, what will it take for it to turn around? Could it turn around at this stage?
There is still a chance, and according to the Commission chairman, he spoke and said that part of the problem is the staff at the Commission who had been implicated in the commission of irregularities during the election of August, which was nullified by the Supreme Court. And he said that he had asked them to step aside, but we haven't seen any movement in that direction. And in terms of the public, people are really apprehensive, because this is a country that has a history of violence following presidential elections, and it's something that the chairman also talked about. He said that he does not want to be that person who will lead Kenya down that path again. So he has to make very tough decisions this week, but he needs the cooperation of everybody, all the political actors. He needs their cooperation.
I mean, neither of the two scenarios are good, because if it does go ahead, as planned and as scheduled, it will be hugely flawed, not credible, and there'll be so many question marks on it. And if it doesn't go on, like you say, we're at a stalemate. Who makes a decision afterward to go forward? Who makes a decision on what happens next?
It's the chairman of the commission. He is the one to make the tough decisions right now. Well, if it does go ahead as things stand, if nothing changes, then it could spell trouble for the country, and that is because the main opposition leader, Raila Odinga, says that he is not going to take part in it. He is going to lead the biggest demonstrations we've seen in this country on election day. And so you can imagine in places where you have some of the people going to queue in polling stations to wanting to cast their vote, and you have others, protesters, who are not happy that this process is going on and they want to stop it. That is not a very good scenario. But then if the election does not happen, we've been listening to lawyers trying to argue what will happen if the election is not held within the constitutionally set timelines, that is by the end of this month. What will happen? There are those who say the president remains in office until a new president is elected. There are those who say that he ceases to be president on the 1st of November. So nobody really knows what happens ahead.
Many questions still. Ann Soy, of course, is following this very closely. Our senior Africa correspondent, Ann Soy, from the Kenyan capital, Nairobi.
Now, to the death of 4 US Special Forces servicemen in Niger a few days ago. It drew attention to hidden operations by the US against Islamists in the Sahel. They died up against the border with Mali. But that rather interesting security story has been completely overtaken by reaction to the deaths in the US. The bereaved mother of one of the dead has accused President Donald Trump of being disrespectful during a telephone call which was meant to express condolences.
Mr. Trump denies the claims and has turned his fire on Barack Obama's record in expressing condolences. It is, of course, not the first time President Trump has clashed with bereaved parents, the so-called Gold Star families. From Washington, Gary O'Donoghue reports.
An all too familiar picture. The return of a fallen hero, the grief of a family that will never be the same again. Sergeant LaDavid Johnson was killed along with 3 other soldiers in an ambush in Niger 2 weeks ago. But his family and his local congresswoman say the president disrespected his memory in a phone call just before the body arrived back home.
I was in the car when President Trump called. He never said the word hero. He said to the wife, well, I guess he knew what he was getting into. How insensitive can you be?
What's more, according to the congresswoman, the call left the widow in tears, as the president didn't seem to know her husband's name. In characteristic style, Donald Trump responded on Twitter. Democrat congresswoman totally fabricated what I said to the wife of a soldier who died in action. And I have proof. Sad. The White House later said there was no recording of the phone call. And in the cabinet room, he was asked, just what did you say to Sergeant Johnson's widow?
I did not say what she said, and I'd like her to make the statement again, because I did not say what she said. I had a very nice conversation with the woman, with the wife, who sounded like a lovely woman, did not say what the congresswoman said, and most people aren't too surprised to hear that.
Earlier in the week, the president had to respond to claims that he'd been slow to call and write to the families of fallen service personnel, particularly as almost 2 weeks had passed since the Niger incident. That led him to lash out at his predecessor, accusing President Obama of neglecting to contact families. More than many other countries, America displays a deference and respect for its military, which makes this a controversy the President could well do without.
Gary O'Donoghue reporting from Washington.
Now, Somalia's President Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed has called on his fellow citizens to unite and fight the Islamist group Al-Shabaab after Saturday's huge truck bomb in Mogadishu. He spoke as thousands who marched through the capital in protest. They had to be kept away from the site of the bomb by armed police.
The government says the blast killed at least 280 people. Mohammed Hanad, hospital receptionist in the British city of Bristol, is one of those Somalis in the diaspora grieving the loss of loved ones far away. He told Newsday that he'd lost his cousin in the explosion.
On Saturday, we have learned that one of the worst tragic moments that happened in Somalia's history. My cousin was working in Mogadishu as a businessman. He had his own company. So basically what happened was he was doing his normal day work, and when the explosion happens and my uncle called him, he couldn't answer his phone. Then he started getting worried, and they decided to go down there and see if he's safe or something. They couldn't find. The building was on the floor, nothing left of it. They looked for him everywhere. They couldn't find him for a couple of days, until they found him on Monday evening, some part of his body, and they couldn't find the rest of the body, so they have buried those, only the part they have found, which is something that hurts me a lot, because that person, he wasn't just a cousin to me, he was a close brother to me.
Mohammed Hanad there, a hospital receptionist here in the UK, in the British city of Bristol, mourning the cousin he lost in the explosion in Mogadishu. You're listening to Newsday on the BBC World Service. In the next few minutes, how victory against Boko Haram militants means small farmers in Niger can once again sell their red peppers. That's in a few minutes. Let's remind you of our top headlines. Separatists in the Spanish region of Catalonia are threatening to declare independence if Madrid starts to impose direct rule after a deadline expires in a couple of hours' time. And official figures in China show the pace of economic growth has eased slightly in line with forecasts. Let's get sports headlines now. Matthew Kenyon is here.
Hi, Sharma. Chelsea had a 2-0 lead in their European Champions League clash with Roma and gave it up last night. 3 unanswered goals from the visitors gave them a lead of 3-2 before Chelsea's Eden Hazard grabbed an equaliser for the hosts, the point for which leaves them still top of their pool, but unhappy with the way the evening turned out, according to coach Antonio Conte.
I didn't like the type of football that we did for a lot of part of the game, but it's right to take the responsibility for this. We lost totally our knowledge, our style of football. At the end, I think the result was fair.
Conte later reacted to Jose Mourinho's jibe about coaches crying about injuries, which was widely interpreted as a dig at the man who now has his old job. He was getting into it nicely, Conte, before a Chelsea press officer stepped in and diverted the conversation. Mourinho's Manchester United made it 3 wins from 3. They beat Benfica 1-0 in Portugal. Paris Saint-Germain continued their great start, a 4-0 victory at Anderlecht, and it was a comfortable night for Barcelona as well. They beat Olympiacos 3-1, Lionel Messi with his 100th European goal. In case you didn't catch Focus on Africa last night, here's a line ahead of the World Cup qualifiers next month, the final round of matches in the race for Russia 2018. Senegal, of course, top their pool and have 2 games to play against South Africa after FIFA ordered that controversial replay. And Senegal have called up Liverpool's Sadio Mane, despite his club saying he could be out for up to 6 weeks earlier on this month. More details on the African football pages of the BBC Sports website, where you can also read about Algeria's new coach, former player Rabah Majer, the man who scored the winning goal for Porto in the 1987 European Cup final, and one of his country's greatest ever players returns to a role he last had in 2002. He becomes the country's 5th coach in 3 years, with the job of getting them through to the Africa Cup of Nations in 2019. Now, from football to American football, and President Trump thinks the NFL have simply failed after they declined to put a rule in place demanding players stand for the national anthem in response to the so-called Take the Knee protests in the States. But the league's commission Commissioner Roger Goodell, speaking after a meeting between owners and the Players Union, says they think players should stand, but
we're not afraid of the tough conversations. That's what we're having with our players. That's what we had yesterday, to make sure we understand one another and understand where they're coming from. And I think out of those discussions, they understand that the owners and the NFL really do care about their issues and what we can do to make the communities better. And so I think that's what dialogue's all about, and listening and understanding, so that we can get that kind of understanding between different parties. And that's what is complex about this, but that's why it's also really important to do.
Basically, they're not putting a rule in place, which is going to antagonise President Trump and quite a few others, I think. OS with a sports update at 15:45 and Sport Today at 18:30 GMT.
Many thanks, Matthew. More sports news here on Newsday with Matthew later in the programme.
Now to Niger, and a story about how the fight against Boko Haram means better business, happily, for farmers. The government there has lifted a ban on the sale of the Diffa pepper. Now, this is a bit of a sign that they think they're making headway in their battle against the Islamist militants. Our Africa editor, Mary Harper, explains the thinking.
2 years ago, the authorities imposed a ban on the growing of chili peppers, red chili peppers, in southeastern Niger in the region of Diffa. And the reason why they did this is because Boko Haram militants, who are mainly based in Nigeria, were basically taxing the chili pepper trade because it's lucrative, it's worth millions of dollars a year. In recent days, the government have lifted the ban, basically because the number of Boko Haram attacks in Niger has decreased significantly in recent months, and also because these thousands of chili pepper farmers, they were really suffering because their income was destroyed for a 2-year period. So now the farmers are delighted that they can restart growing these chili peppers, and then they dry them in the sun, and they are considered a particular delicacy throughout Niger and also even across the border in Nigeria. So I'm sure lots of people in the region will also be happy that they can get these Diffa peppers, as they're known, that they can start buying them again once the farmers have grown them and harvested them. Boko Haram and other Islamist groups who operate in Africa do tend to tax the local population. They set up checkpoints where they tax people. For example, in Somalia, the Al-Shabaab group taxes sugar, it taxes charcoal, it basically even taxes people in the capital, Mogadishu. And the same with Boko Haram. Basically, whatever the local people make their income from, Boko Haram, where it kind of controls or attacks regularly, it will tax the local people, because often that's one of the only ways that it's going to get its income. They're not getting massive flows of money from abroad.
Mary Harper, about 6,000 producers. Good news for them. They can get back to growing the Diffa.
Let's take you to the DRC now. The Virunga National Park in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo is home to the Nyiragongo volcano. It towers over one of the most volatile regions in the world, but it hasn't erupted since 2002, and violence in the area has eased, so an increasing number of tourists are climbing to the top again, as the BBC's Charlotte Atwood reports.
Welcome to Virunga National Park. We are at Kibati. My name is Jalu.
We're about halfway up the climb of Mount Nyiragongo. We're travelling with a group of tourists. Jean-Loup is our guide, our ranger for this trip. Jean-Loup, how high are we now?
Now we are at 2,400 meters of altitude, almost at the middle of our track.
So I can already feel the air thinning as we're climbing. Is it going to get harder?
Yeah, it's a bit hard because the place where we are is very steep, and we can see how lava went down.
Yeah, so the path that we're climbing up is actually the same route, it looks like, that the lava came down in the last eruption. The whole trail is made out of hardened black lava. We've finally made it to the summit of the volcano, and I'm sitting on the edge of a vast crater, and 600 metres below me, right in the middle, is an enormous bubbling lava lake. With me here is Gavin, who is from the UK and has climbed up with us to come and see this spectacular sight.
I've been to a couple of volcanoes before that haven't been active. I expected an active one to have a little bit of off-gas or something, but this is just, it's like a soup just kind of brewing and stewing, and it's just, you could spend all night out here if it wasn't so cold just checking out the lava flows. It's incredible.
The top of Mount Nyiragongo is 3,470 metres high, so it's really cold up here, but I can feel the warmth of the burning lava lake from the edge of the crater. The tranquility of the Virunga National Park is in stark contrast with the city below. Goma, Eastern DRC's largest city, was part destroyed by the last eruption 15 years ago. 90,000 people lost their homes and dozens of residents died.
We saw the smoke, but we didn't know what an eruption was. Some people even moved closer to see what was happening. That's how so many people died. They were ignorant. We didn't even know that lava burned everything they touched.
But there was a group of Congolese scientists monitoring the volcano at the time. Celestine Mahinda, director of the Goma Volcanologist Observatory, says his warnings went ignored.
Because myself, I was alone as a scientist on the top of Nyiragongo. We have to add more scientists and to learn more.
Today, some parts of the city are built around the solidified lava, and the local population is much more aware of the risks than before. The scientists work 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
The volcano is like a sick person, and we have to monitor every time, every second, every 4 minutes. We have seismic data. Every 10 minutes, we have the situation of temperatures.
Volcanologist Mahinda is now a local celebrity. If his family leaves town, residents worry about another eruption. But for now, there are no warning signs and the tourists continue to climb.
The BBC's Charlotte Atwood there reporting from the Nyiragongo volcano in the Virunga National Park, Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo.
You make me feel so young. You make me feel so spring has sprung.
To Michael Jackson, it's an incredible, they're both in the same room at the same time, OMG, but also, I'm wondering what they're talking about. Are they complaining about the Coke? Is it a bad cup of tea? Because you're there listening to the conversation as well as snapping the moment.
I listen with one ear. I'm actually listening with my eyes, if that makes any sense. I don't necessarily want to hear what people are talking about, but as I found out some years later, after Michael showed up with his brothers at the show, apparently Freddie went back to Michael's house and they did some recording for a couple of nights. Some of those tracks, I believe, were just released in the last year or two. So they might have been talking about, do you want to come over to my house, Freddie? And record some stuff. I would bet that that's part of what they were talking about.
And when
probably not complaining about the tea.
When I read that you have cabinets in your office which sort of go ABBA to Aerosmith and all the way to ZZ Top, it gives an idea of who you've done. Is there anyone you haven't done that you can't now, or anyone that you want to?
Well, I'm not old enough to have photographed Elvis. Well, I almost photographed Elvis. I shouldn't say I'm not old enough, but I was hired to shoot his backup band, the Girls of Sweet Inspirations. And when I showed up in Las Vegas to do that, I asked the publicist, I said, is there any way I can shoot Elvis after I shoot the girls? And he said, well, you have to talk to one person, the Colonel. And long story short, the Colonel was in the middle of a craps game in Las Vegas, and I was bothering him. And not only was I not allowed to shoot Elvis, but The second the girls were finished with their set, I was escorted right out of the showroom with the door locked behind me. So never got to shoot Elvis, never got to shoot John Lennon, one of my two idols of my life. I did shoot one person for this book, which is one of the two people I've always wanted to shoot, and that is Courtney Love. The other person might sound strange, but Christina Aguilera, who I feel has, the voice of the century.
I find it really difficult to talk to people if I don't have my microphone and my recorder with me. How do you find it talking to these people without the camera there?
That's a really good question, actually. God, I got to think about that. I feel normal, most normal, with a camera on my shoulder. And it's been that way since I got my first camera. So there are people who have become close friends of mine, like Brian May, Stevie Nicks, other people that I'm certainly comfortable with, without a camera. But and they don't always expect me to have one either. So it goes both ways. But I do feel most whole and most normal with a camera, even if I'm not necessarily using it.
You see, just like us and microphones, I'm totally silent when I go home. Neil Preston, Neal Preston, if you want to look him up. He's got a very generous website, actually, that gives
great
you
photos,
contact sheets, trailers, really interesting stuff into the business of being one of the world's best rock and roll photographers.
This is the BBC World Service.
100 women on the BBC World Service.
The high rates of caesareans in Brazil have been dubbed an epidemic. Amid this culture of C-sections, do women have a say in how they want to give birth? I'm Julia Carneiro, and I've come back to my hometown to find out why so few babies here are born naturally.
C-section Brazil at bbcworldservice.com/100women. You're listening to the BBC World Service.
Our Latin America online editor is Vanessa Bushluter, and she is...
Let's speak now to our Moscow correspondent, Steve Rosenberg. And Steve,
our correspondent, Bethany Bell, has been following the UN talks.
Our South America correspondent, Katie Watson, spoke to us from Sao Paulo.
At bbcworldservice.com. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello and welcome to Newsday in the BBC World Service with Shaima Khalil and Lawrence Pollard.
Our top story is in Spain with a second deadline looming. The pressure is on for Catalonia's leader to clarify where he stands on independence from Spain. If that doesn't happen in the next 2 hours, the government in Madrid says it will suspend the region's autonomy.
In Malta, journalists are planning to go on a march in memory of the investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was killed by a car bomb.
And after US-backed forces have announced the liberation of the Syrian city of Raqqa from so-called Islamic State control, we speak to a photographer who's been on the ground this week.
And Venezuela as well. The crisis and the political standoff have affected every aspect of life, including sport. More on that, a report from our man in Caracas a little later. All that coming up, plus the business as well, after the latest stories.
I'm Stuart McIntosh with the BBC News. Hello. The head of Catalonia's regional government says he'll activate an independence declaration if Madrid takes steps to impose direct rule. Spain's central government has been pressing Carles Puigdemont to confirm whether Catalonia intends to secede after a disputed referendum earlier this month. A deadline set by Madrid for his response is due to run out in 2 hours. Tom Burridge is in Barcelona.
If Catalonia's devolved government does not clearly state that it has not declared independence from Spain, then the Spanish government will make an unprecedented move. It will, for the first time ever, invoke broad constitutional powers. In reality, it will be a list of measures designed to exert direct control over the Catalan authorities. For Madrid, this is about protecting the Spanish constitution and disciplining an unruly, disobedient, devolved government, which held an illegal referendum earlier this month.
New figures show that China's economy grew 6.8% in the third quarter. Robin Brandt in Beijing has the details.
As is so often the case, the official figures are in line with those forecast by China's government. That is especially helpful at the moment because China's ruling Communist Party is currently meeting here in its 5-yearly gathering to anoint President Xi Jinping for another term. At 6.8% growth, the economy is expanding slightly slower than at the start of the year, but it's above the goal for all of 2017. But China is experiencing a slowdown. It's gradual, but the economy here is expanding at its smallest rate for a generation.
The British banking groups HSBC and Standard Chartered are likely to be investigated over new claims that they may have been used to launder money stolen from the South African state. The British Treasury has referred allegations raised by the former Cabinet Minister Peter Hain to the Serious Fraud Office. From Johannesburg, Andrew Harding reports.
This is a new twist in a giant corruption scandal that's shaking the South African state and damaging the reputations of a number of global companies. Lord Hain says whistleblowers have told him that hundreds of millions of pounds have been taken out of South Africa illegally via Hong Kong and Dubai. The Treasury has now asked the Serious Fraud Office and other agencies to investigate whether HSBC and Standard Chartered may, unwittingly, have been used to transfer stolen funds. At the centre of the allegations are South Africa's President Jacob Zuma and a wealthy business family, the Guptas. Both deny any wrongdoing.
Scientists in Germany have documented a steep decline in the population of flying insects in less than 30 years. The study, carried out in 63 German nature reserves, showed a loss of more than 3/4 of the total biomass of flying insects, including butterflies, bees and moths. World News from the BBC. Venezuela's Constituent Assembly has sworn in 18 of its newly elected regional governors in a ceremony that was boycotted by the opposition, which has denounced Sunday's vote as fraudulent. The majority of the 23 regional governorships were won by supporters of the socialist government. It's 30 years since global stock markets crashed in an event that came to be known as Black Monday. Here's our economics correspondent, Andrew Walker.
The fall in New York's Dow Jones index was, in percentage terms, its largest ever one-day decline. Some have put the blame on computerized trading, which triggered rapid selling of shares. Trading systems in New York were overwhelmed at times by the sheer volume of orders, which may have aggravated the instability. 30 years on, some experts fear that stock markets are once again unsustainably high. Share prices have risen strongly as a result of low interest rate and other policies pursued by many central banks in response to the financial crisis of 10 years ago.
New Zealand's Labour Party will form the country's new government in coalition with the small nationalist party New Zealand First and the Green Party. The announcement has just been made by Winston Peters, the New Zealand First leader. The announcement follows inconclusive elections nearly a month ago in which neither the Labour Party nor the National Party won enough votes to form a majority government. New Zealand First has common ground with Labour on a number of key policies, including limiting immigration and foreign ownership. An appeal court in Tunis has upheld the public indecency conviction of a couple arrested in September for kissing in a car. Nessim Awadi, who is French, was also accused of refusing to obey police after they apprehended him and his Tunisian girlfriend. The couple were given lighter sentences than the original terms. The case prompted widespread outrage on social media and triggered a debate in Tunisia over public morality and the role of the police. BBC News.
Many thanks for the latest, Stuart. Hello and welcome to Newsday. Shaima and Lawrence with you this morning.
This half hour you'll hear from a journalist in Malta where he and others are planning to march in honour of their friend and colleague Daphne Caruana Galizia, the investigative journalist who had been accusing the island's government of corruption and who died in a car bomb attack.
And we'll get the view of a photographer who's been on the ground in Raqqa, the former stronghold of the so-called Islamic State in Syria. US-backed forces have taken the city back from the militants. So what's it like now? Find out in the next half hour.
Now, to Spain's troubled region of Catalonia and the deadline after the deadline. The burning question is, has Catalonia, or has it not, declared independence from Spain? To remind you of events so far, the regional leader, Carles Puigdemont, called a referendum on independence from Spain. He said he won, but then said he wasn't technically declaring independence until he'd had more negotiations with the government in Madrid.
Madrid instead set him a deadline to say if he had or hadn't declared independence, which passed, and then set another deadline, which is about to expire. If he doesn't make his position clear in about 2 hours' time, they will assume he has declared independence and will impose direct rule.
Now, this is under an element of the Constitution called Article 155. Mr. Puigdemont is now reported as saying that if direct rule is imposed, he will declare independence. Is it legal? Is it constitutional? Have you followed us thus far? We need a professor of constitutional law. So we spoke to one not long ago, Carlos Flores. He's at the University of Valencia. So I asked him, what happens in 2 hours' time when that deadline expires?
Well, to begin with, President Puigdemont was given a deadline which finished last Monday to clarify whether he had declared independence or not, and a second deadline which ends up today, 10 o'clock our time, to revert the measures taken. So far, he took refuge in ambiguity in order to respond to the first question, as you clarified. But now there is no place to ambiguity. I mean, the government is requiring that the laws that the constitution that he passed earlier in September be declared null and void, and that's something that requires clear action on his side, that it's not going to be taken. So after his more than previsible silence, the way to suspend autonomy is wide open for the central government.
Right, and how clear is the process of doing that? Because I understand from reading around this that article in the Constitution, this now famous Article 155, it's not written with the idea of doing this now. It was written in 1978. It's now being interpreted to mean something. How would that happen?
Well, the problem is that, as it many times happens with constitutional law, you don't address an issue when it is not an issue, when it's not a candid issue, and when it becomes a hot issue, you prefer not to deal with it. So we have the article in the Constitution, but we don't have any law that clarifies the scope of this provision. The provision was taken from the German basic law, where it has never been applied, and it has never been applied before here. So basically, what we know, or what the Constitution tells, is that when the government considers that the self-governing community does not fulfill the obligations imposed upon it by the Constitution or other laws, or acts in a way that is seriously prejudicial to the general interests of Spain, the government may intervene in this community.
But there is no statement of what that intervention means, because it could be anything from just saying something on television in an address to the nation to sending in the troops.
No. In order to send the troops, you need to apply another article, which is 116, which prevents the declaration of the state of emergency, which is a different thing. No, in this case, basically what the government can do is to take measures necessary to compel the community to meet said obligations and even instruct the authorities of this community. So we are not in the domain of a martial rule at all.
Right, that's good to know. Now, the regional leader, Mr. Puigdemont has said that if this step is taken, he will declare independence again or more officially. But there is this idea floating around of another election, the possibility of another election in Catalonia, to a regional election to sort of cut the Gordian knot, to try to start afresh. Who calls that constitutionally?
Well, at this point, the only person who can call a new election is President Puigdemont himself. But if the autonomy was suspended and his functions, his role was taken over by the central government, it could be the central government who called for this election. And believe me, these two possibilities are entirely different scenarios. If the central government called the elections, it may be forced to face the boycott of the local governments, or the Catalan government himself, who would not cooperate, or the Catalan nationalist parties who would not run for this election. But if it was President Puigdemont who called the election, he would basically compromising his own future and the future of his party and the future of his project.
I quite envy his students. That's Professor Carlos Flores, making it as clear as anyone has made it, I think, even though we were just getting our head around Article 155 of the Spanish Constitution. He goes and throws in 116, but he explained things pretty clearly. Carlos Flores, Professor of Constitutional Law at the University of Valencia. That deadline set to expire in just under 2 hours' time.
Let's take you to Malta now, where journalists on the Mediterranean island will march later today to honour Daphne Caruana Galizia. The investigative journalist had accused the island's government of corruption and was killed by a car bomb earlier this week. Her son has since denounced Malta as a mafia state. The BBC's John Sweeney looks back at what we know of Daphne's enemies.
Monday afternoon, Daphne Caruana Galizia leaves home. 2 explosions are heard, creating a ball of fire inside her car. It skids off the road and ends up in this field. She dies almost instantly. Her youngest son is first on scene. Police believe that the explosive was Semtex, a first for Malta. As executions go, this was a high-end job. They targeted Daphne and Daphne alone. The bomb maker knew his stuff. And the killer who triggered the bomb almost certainly had sight of her. So what does all that tell us about the people who ordered the hit? That they're sophisticated, they're organised, and they've got money.
John Sweeney there. Daphne worked in particular on the so-called Panama paper leaks, uncovering murky connections between powerful figures in Malta and offshore companies. We can speak now to Herman Grech, the online editor at the Times of Malta. Herman, thank you for joining us.
Morning.
This story has brought to the surface a very dark reality in Malta, a reality that many of us really hadn't realized existed in that magnitude. Daphne's family are not sure that her death will change any of that reality. What do you think?
Well, we knew there was certain, there's this kind of this underground dodgy scene we don't know really much about. The irony is Malta is statistically one of the safest countries in Europe to go to. Yet we've had 5 car bombs in the last 18 months. In the middle of the street, you see a car blowing up, and the people behind it have never been brought to justice. So suddenly, when a journalist is killed for doing her work, it hits home more than ever that this is a serious problem we need to deal with.
The problem, of course, is that Daphne was working on this almost alone. You know, she was the one that was going behind the scenes, digging deep into these allegations and trying to find the truth. There isn't a culture of holding people to account in Malta, deep investigations like that.
No, I tend to disagree with that statement because even my own news organization, we do carry out our investigations. It doesn't mean we always get answers, but Daphne probably went further where it came to naming certain individuals, putting their pictures up on her own blog and calling them the most despicable names. You might choose to disagree with her methods, but she did a lot of investigative work. It doesn't mean there's a culture of ignoring the illegalities which go on in this country. Yes, there are illegalities, but in reality, it's no banana state or banana republic state or mafia state as some of the international press is calling it. It really is not.
Well, Daphne's son called it a mafia state. What do you say to that?
Yes, if my own mother was blown up in a car, I'd probably say worse than that.
What kind of reaction or, I would say, threats did you or any of the other journalists were getting if you dug too deep into a story? Did you get pushback as well, in your experience?
It's not really that, because there is freedom of expression. What insults me is hearing a junior minister 2 days ago, kind of almost telling journalists, look, be careful what you write about, because, you know, there are some people who might get too upset and then they take the rule of law into their hands. That upsets me. Fine, she later apologized. But some people here seem to not understand the idea of a free and open press. And if you want to take it out against the press for saying something which is wrong, then there are legal means to do it, not taking the law into your hands.
But it's almost as if the government officials are saying, look, you know, it's out of our hands. If you write something, you know, you'll get what's coming to you.
No, to be fair, look, the Prime Minister is condemning this from A to Z. Last night he made some very strong statements in Parliament. Remember, at this stage, we still don't know who's behind it. Daphne had a lot of enemies. She took on a lot of people, from drug lords to money launderers to politicians. So we really don't have no idea. The only problem is the cynicism of people who believe they cannot. This case will never be resolved, and that worries me.
Is that why you and your colleagues are marching today?
We are marching today because, first of all, an act of solidarity towards a colleague. This is one of the most despicable acts ever carried out in this country. And we need to show whoever did this, we will stand up to intimidation, whoever it's coming from. We will not stop. We will definitely continue investigating the underworld and people who are doing things illegally. We will challenge a society which thinks that it can get away with murder, literally. So our message will be very simple. From a group of journalist colleagues of Daphne Caruana Galizia, we will not be afraid.
But are you confident that you can get to the bottom of who did this to Daphne?
I'm afraid not.
Just final words. I know that you knew Daphne personally, and I've read some of the tributes that you wrote about her also on our website at the BBC. What has the journalistic society or community lost when Daphne was killed?
Look, you said I know Daphne. In reality, we knew Daphne professionally. She was a very private person. Very few people actually knew Daphne Caruana Galizia. Of course, we all had our arguments with Daphne. She was that kind of person. But in reality, we lost somebody who had a very, very popular blog. Whether people went for it to get the investigative stuff or sometimes even, the quirky stuff, maybe even gossip. But Malta has definitely lost a big voice where it came to the media.
Herman Grech, many thanks for joining us. Herman Grech, the online editor of the Times of Malta. Later today, he and other journalists are going to be marching in honour of Daphne Caruana Galizia.
19 minutes past the hour. This is the BBC World Service. Stay with us. Fresh insight on the situation in Raqqa. Recently liberated from the grip of the militants of so-called Islamic State. We'll be speaking to a photographer who's had access to what is left of the city. The headlines, Catalonia, separatists there are threatening to declare independence if the government in Madrid decides to impose direct rule on their region after a deadline which expires in just over an hour and a half. And British officials have been asked to investigate the banking groups HSBC and Standard Chartered over alleged links to a corruption scandal in South Africa. We're going to be talking business in a moment, but now sport. Matthew Kenyon.
Here's a quote. I didn't like the type of football we were trying to play for most of the game. Not the reaction of a Chelsea fan to their 3-3 draw with Roma last night, having been 2-0 up, but that of their manager, Antonio Conte. No such doubts for Jose Mourinho, whose Manchester United side won 1-0 away at Benfica. Mourinho's teams are often criticised for their defensive style of play. His message? Tough. Sometimes I feel being good defensively is a crime, he said, but that's a way of getting results. Diego Simeone, coach of Atletico Madrid, says he thinks his players can turn round their situation after that surprise draw with Qarabag. They are third behind Chelsea and Roma with only 2 points from 3 games so far. And the NFL has said it won't force players to stand for the national anthem in the States, but thinks they should. That wasn't good enough for President Trump, who declared too much talk, not enough action.
What a result for Qarabag.
Fantastic, yeah, really
they play
fantastic.
Back
their
first
Qarabag. Point
yeah,
in
they're amazing.
The Champions League.
Yeah, we were covering their arrival at the Champions League level, and now they've got a point with Atletico Madrid as well. Excellent stuff. 20 minutes past the hour. No, 21 minutes past the hour. Time for business now. We're going to talk an anniversary. This is a good one. Black Monday, when stock markets around the world collapsed. I think it was 20% in America got wiped off in just a day. It was 30 years ago today. Now, at the moment, we're seeing stock markets at an all-time high. So the question is, could it happen again? Viv Nunes, I should say Mystic Viv, is going to gaze into the crystal ball. Just remind us what was going on then, and what are the similarities to now?
Yeah, so if you look at the trajectory of the Dow Jones, that's the main index in the US this year compared with 1987 and 1929 when we saw that other great financial crash, it is pretty similar. And both those years, October came though, and then the markets plummeted, as you say, nearly 23% nearly was wiped off Wall Street in just that day. So is it going to happen again? That's the question. Many commentators say some kind of correction is coming, but it's just not clear when. I mean, if you look at the Dow Jones this year, it's gone past 23,000 points. It started the year just under 20,000, so that climb has been quite astonishing. The other two major indices in the US, the Nasdaq and the S&P 500, also posted record levels on Wednesday. And what do we normally see before a crash? We see markets rally. So is the bubble going to burst this time in 2017? John Lonsky is with Moody's Analytics.
It always does. So investors need to approach the current market with caution. This is not a great time to get into the market. After all, you're paying for overvalued assets. Instead, perhaps you can hold on to your current investments and then hopefully be able to get out of the way before bad news inevitably strikes.
Wow, pretty gloomy assessment there from John Lonsky. How common is that view amongst commentators?
Well, some commentators argue that the market fundamentals now are much stronger than they were back in 1987, and there isn't this kind of blind faith in the markets that we saw back then. Laura Lambie is one of them. She's Senior Investment Director at Investec Wealth and Investment, and she argues that the company results we see today are good enough to justify the market numbers that we're seeing going up and up.
There are similarities certainly between now and 87. Inflation was beginning to be seen as a threat. Interest rates were on their way up. There were some trade wars between US and Germany. But I think what is perhaps different is that the levels of optimism and euphoria that we witnessed then are notably absent now. And I think there's probably a basis and fundamentals of why markets are good, and all that's to do with corporate earnings coming through.
So Laura Lambie there. Divergent views we're seeing then. I'm afraid I can't tell you, Lawrence. My crystal ball looking pretty cloudy.
We need some sound
if there's going to be a crash.
I think you did that item today so that you can tell us in the future, I told you so. You see, I told you so. And we will play the clip of you saying, there have been concerns. Thank you. Viv Nunes, looking in her crystal ball.
The United Nations say they are ready to go into the Syrian city of Raqqa after the so-called Islamic State was driven out this week. A UN official in Damascus told the BBC that around 300,000 people were in need of aid after fleeing the city to nearby camps. Aid workers say it may take years before they can return to their homes. Let's speak to Ivor Prickett, a photographer who was in Raqqa this week and joins us now. Ivor, give us a sense of what it's like, or what it's been like this week, the scene in Raqqa where you were.
Yeah, so I was there up until Monday this week. I'd been there for about 10 days, working for the New York Times, doing a reportage, and yeah, it was, a ghost city without a single building that hadn't been, damaged over the course of the 4-month offensive to retake it from the Islamic State. And, a city devoid of any human presence apart from the soldiers fighting on the ground. And that was what was most kind of noticeable, was just how quiet it was. Apart from the sounds of the war, there were no people there anymore.
You say it's a ghost city. Is it a city that you can imagine anyone returning to or living there again in the future?
Not for a long time. I mean, the level of destruction is really catastrophic, and hard to take in when you're driving around. And I mean, the SDF, the Kurdish-led US-backed militia who were conducting the operation on the ground didn't let us move around very freely, even though it was very close to being liberated, and ultimately was announced as liberated on Tuesday, because they said it's so littered. There are so many unexploded bombs and IEDs and mines that.
So your movement was very restricted when you were there.
Very restricted. Very restricted.
I'm looking at a picture that you took in a New York Times article, and it's one of a neighborhood, and it, like you said, it's completely destroyed. Houses are destroyed, pockmarks everywhere, and there's one sole soldier walking through a completely empty street, and I feel like this just tells the current story of Raqqa at the moment.
Yes, yeah, that summed it up for me as well, because the fighting had largely finished by the time I got there. The final phase was very much a flushing out exercise, and there were these negotiations that led to the surrender of a large number of fighters. So yeah, it was a very strange war zone in the end. Very, very quiet, very eerie when you were moving around, which is in some ways more disconcerting.
And we talk about Raqqa, which is the center of fighting, because this is the symbolic state or caliphate, or the center of what used to be called the caliphate of the so-called Islamic State. Did you see other areas around Raqqa, and what were they like?
Yeah, well, obviously you can't stay in Raqqa when you're covering it, so you're staying a couple of hundred miles north of there, near the border with Turkey, and you're passing through small villages on the outskirts of Raqqa, and then a few small towns before you get to Kobani on the border, where most people have to stay. And life there has largely come back and gone back to normal, but it is affected heavily by the outflux of people from Raqqa and now Deir ez-Zor, the countryside, to the kind of south east of Raqqa, where the fight against the last remaining ISIS militants in Syria is now taking place. So you have these kind of informal camps popping up as people flee, and it's a very kind of strange environment there at the moment.
Ivor, many thanks for joining us. Ivor Prickett there, a photographer who was in Raqqa in the past week. Raqqa now has been rid of the so-called Islamic State. They've been driven out. The United States says they are ready to go back, but the rebuilding will start.
This is the BBC World Service. Now, take a moment to listen to this.
What intrigues us?
Dogs have a really unique, special ability to read and understand us.
What alters our view?
Every time we look around, we just say, it's the homeless people. But they have names, they have dreams and pasts and everything.
There are stories that make us wonder.
They talk about having an intimate, not just a sexual relationship with the robot. And that's hard because it's a one-way relationship. The machine can't love you back.
And ones that defy all belief.
I found members of different communities, Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs, stabbed, lying on the street.
The more we know about the world, the more we understand about ourselves.
Many of us didn't really think bisexuality existed.
Documentaries on the BBC World Service.
To listen, go to bbcworldservice.com/documentaries.
Hello and welcome. This is Newsday from the BBC World Service with Shaima Khalil and Lawrence Pollard.
Coming up with two senior election officials now saying the vote won't be credible. What does that mean for the rerun of the Kenyan presidential elections?
And the U.S. president has been criticized for being insensitive towards the family of one of the 4 U.S. servicemen killed earlier this month in Niger. We'll have more on that in the next half hour.
But first to Spain and our roundup of the latest world news.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. The head of Catalonia's regional government has said he will activate an independence declaration if Spain takes steps to impose direct rule. Spain's central government has been pressing Carles Puigdemont to confirm whether Catalonia intends to secede after a disputed referendum earlier this month. A deadline set by Madrid for his response is due to run out shortly. The British banking groups HSBC and Standard Chartered are likely to be investigated over new claims that they may have unwittingly been used to launder money stolen from the South African state. The British Finance Ministry has referred allegations raised by the former Cabinet Minister Lord Hayne to the Serious Fraud Office. New Zealand's Labour Party will form the country's new government in coalition with the small nationalist party New Zealand First and the Green Party. The Labour leader, Jacinda Ardern, who only took up the role in August, will be Prime Minister. New Zealand First has common ground with Labour on a number of key policies, including limiting immigration and foreign ownership. New figures show that China's economy grew 6.8% in the third quarter. The figures were in line with expectations. Observers say the data will add weight to the Chinese government's assertion of good economic management. Scientists in Germany have documented a steep decline in the population of flying insects in less than 30 years. The study, carried out in 63 German nature reserves, showed a loss of more than 3/4 of the total biomass of flying insects, butterflies, bees and moths. It's 30 years since global stock markets crashed in an event that came to be known as Black Monday. New York's main index, the Dow Jones, experienced in percentage terms its biggest ever drop in a single day. Some analysts attributed the event to the introduction of computerized trading. BBC News.
Thanks to Jerry. Hello, this is Shima and Lawrence with Newsday. We'll start in Kenya in a moment. Then we hear from a Gold Star mother, one who lost a son serving in the US military. What does she think of the row over presidential condolences?
Also why the windscreen test is right. There are fewer bugs splatting on your cars and buses, and it matters. And we have this.
The crowd become frenzied, frantic, surging forward like a wave of tiny convulsing bodies rising and crashing. Young girls and their mothers are thrown against walls. Others are clawing at the floor, pupils dilated, mouths distended.
Quite the picture. Exorcism demons in Zanzibar, a traditional way to tackle mental health issues on an island that has a big problem, but only one mental health hospital. That's coming up a bit later.
But let's start with the question of whether Kenya is ready for next week's rerun of the presidential election.
Yesterday, a senior member of Kenya's Electoral Commission resigned and told this program that the electoral body was under political siege. It was unable to take any decisions and could not hold credible elections.
Since then, the chairman of the Electoral Commission, Wafula Chebukati, has said he couldn't guarantee credible elections either.
It's already painful for me to be on record